Hi, everyone. Good Tuesday afternoon and welcome to Go Local Live. I'm Go Local News editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for joining us in studio. As just a little while ago, had the opportunity to catch up with Congressman Joe Kennedy III, looking to run for the Senate in Massachusetts, and of course, former Congressman Patrick Kennedy in support of his cousin. You can see those videos on Go Local Live. And as we do every Tuesday, just about, check in with Jennifer Lawless at the University of Virginia, professor of politics. Jennifer, thank you for joining us.
Happy to.
So let's kick off with the impeachment report coming out today. Of course, the Democrats saying clear case for the president's abuse of power, seeking outside interference. What now?
Well, I think it's important to note that this report that was issued is broad. So this is not one of these very narrow reports that says on such and such a day he did such and such a thing, right? It's a broad abuse of power allegation, which means that although the phone call with Ukraine is a key component of it, it allows for the possibility of many, many other pieces of Donald Trump's behavior to be considered impeachment worthy as well. The expectation is that the committee will vote along and Congress will vote along party lines. There are expected to be no surprises in the House of Representatives. But I do think it sets out basically a rough summary of what we can expect during the Senate trial.
And of course, looking at the impeachment hearing tomorrow on the Hill. But let's talk a little bit about the president's stance. As you said, everyone lining up along party lines are going to be likely impeached in the House. Of course, the Senate being Republican. Likely to not. Let's talk about the president's, again, position that this is just political theater. If it's a fait accompli, if the House is going to and the Senate's not going to, and this is an exercise in politics that energizes his base, let's talk a little bit about that argument.
Well, I think tomorrow provides an opportunity that's a little bit different in terms of the hearings, because what we're going to see are a bunch of constitutional scholars laying out the reasons that this behavior is impeachment worthy and laying out reasons that and processes by which the impeachment process should be conducted. And so this is one of those opportunities, I think, for Republicans to really hurt themselves. If they play partisan politics to completely impartial non-politicians, not even bureaucrats who are working in the government, but mostly constitutional scholars, they might send a signal to suggest that they're really not taking this as seriously as they should be. So there is a little bit of an opportunity, I think, for the Democrats to chip away at least public opinion among independents who might be disinclined to support impeachment. And depending on how it goes, there might be enough for some Republicans in the Senate to at least be a little bit more open-minded. It's hard to figure out how you get to 2/3 in the Senate, but if it turns out that scholars who are sort of seen as reputable on both sides of the aisle say that this seems to have legs, then you could imagine a scenario whereby Mitt Romney or Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski are at least even more non-committal than they've been.
Now, of course, today the news, an appeals court ruled that banks do have to turn over Trump financial documents. Obviously, another avenue as we continue looking at the politics of D.C. Is that something that folks should be keeping an eye on?
Well, this is now going to be, I think, the third appeals court decision that's going to the Supreme Court. So there's going to be no real action. My sense is that he's supposed to turn over these documents within a week, and then every week thereafter, there are supposed to be more and more documents. But the appeal is already going to be on its way. Now, the thing that's kind of interesting about this is that all three of these decisions are consistent with one another. So if the Supreme Court chooses to weigh in, they're going to be weighing in based on the overall importance of the topic, not because there are these competing appeals court decisions and they need to lend clarity to that. But generally speaking, this is not good news for Donald Trump, especially because the decision makes clear that there are certain pieces of these documents that don't need to be public. So for example, if he paid for personal medical expenses, we don't need to know that as a country. But in terms of any kinds of financial documents that could bear directly on his business dealings, we certainly do. And that's something that he's been trying to keep away from the public now for years.
And let's tack to folks who want to unseat the president. Kamala Harris dropping out of the race today. De facto, the rating, I believe, though, was on the wall a few days earlier when a former top staffer jumped to the Bloomberg campaign and made a very public damning indictment of the Harris campaign.
Right. So the public indictment of the Harris campaign was important for two reasons. The first is that it spoke to the inability to raise the kinds of money that were needed to stay viable. The second was that she treated her staff really poorly. And that's a problem, right? Because if you can't pay people well, then you certainly need to have their loyalty. And if you're not treating them well, that becomes a major issue. So what I would say is that I find it not surprising that she would determine that there's no path forward. And dropping out, I think, was a pretty brave move, and frankly, a message and a signal that a lot of other candidates should take. If we want to have a vigorous debate heading into Iowa and New Hampshire, we can't have 17 people on the stage. And if you look at some of the people that still remain, the notions that they think they're competitive when Kamala Harris deemed herself no longer able to run is somewhat laughable.
Let's talk a little bit about that, those candidates that do end up dropping out, and of course the swirling speculation of who could potentially be on that VP shortlist. The life post-campaign, of course, it's like you go from 90 miles an hour to stop, but is there really a stop when dropouts are still jockeying for that VP post?
Well, I think it depends on who you were and why you dropped out. So, in the last couple of days, both Steve Bullock and Joe Sestak dropped out. People probably had no idea Joe Sestak was even running, and they forgot about Steve Bullock a couple of months ago. So for them, I think the stop probably means a real stop. For Kamala Harris, the question becomes, okay, she was only polling in the low single digits, but who gets that 3 or 4% of her vote? Right? Steve Bullock and Joe Sestak weren't drawing any supporters. But if Biden can count on these Harris voters, or if Booker can count on these Harris voters, there are different, there are different paths that this race could potentially take. And I think that Joe Biden, for example, made very, very gracious remarks about Harris dropping out. He called her a first-rate intellect and, a true competitor. I think he believes those things, but I think he also wants to make it clear that he is happy to be the recipient of any of her voters. So, somebody that was seen at one point as a top-tier candidate, and even now as somebody that was sort of a surprise person to drop out, is in a different arena, I think, than some of these other candidates. And certainly she's going to be a top contender for the VP slot, regardless of who winds up getting the nomination.
I mean, certainly, the senator was a clear thorn in the former vice president's side in that first debate. How easy would it be for him to pick up those voters when she went guns a-blazing for him and made some incredibly valid points that really put some chinks in his armor?
I think most people at this point, especially in Iowa and New Hampshire, if you look at the polls, haven't decided on, even the ones who have indicated that they have a preference, haven't said that they're fully behind that candidate. And so if Kamala Harris at this point wanted to endorse a candidate, I think that could go a long way. She won't, right? There's no reason to. But if she says, look, anybody on this stage is better than Donald Trump, I'm not sure that the barbs she traded with Joe Biden early on are going to really matter.
Before I let you go, the president, of course, overseas with a lot of news coming back, interaction with Macron and his indication that a trade deal with China is apparently nowhere imminent, causing the Dow to drop precipitously. Any takeaways from the president on the foreign stage?
Well, I mean, the other point that he made this morning, which was somewhat insane, was the notion that he would put Canada on a payment plan for all of the money that they've owed back in time to NATO. I mean, this is completely insane. You give the man a microphone and he actually says what he thinks, which is somewhat refreshing, but also somewhat petrifying. I think that in the broad scheme of things, the comments about Macron and the comments about all of these other nations now not only having to pay their fair share, but also owing retroactively are probably not going to have much in the way of legs. But, I do think that he just sounds out of his element still when he's on the foreign stage, and it's been 3 years. So, I think that these are the kinds of questions that the Democratic candidates running for president do a very good job at answering. And I think that that's one of the ways that they can quell voters' concerns about, their own domestic policies in some ways, because anybody that cares about international relations is going to be, I think, a little bit, even Republicans, a little bit taken by how poorly Donald Trump has performed.
But does he not play into his base? If, folks have perhaps nationalistic tendencies, saying, why are we getting all this involvement if we're the ones paying? I mean, does he not energize his base by saying to the rest of the world, pony up?
He does, but you know what? That base is energized. At this point, I don't know that they could be any more energetic. He can say and do anything. They're totally happy. They're thrilled. He can say completely disgusting, sketchy things about Lisa Page. They're thrilled. He can yell at Macron. They're thrilled. He's got them, right? And it's hard to imagine any scenario by which he loses them. So he's going to continue to behave this way, but it's not the base that will decide the election. The people who will decide the election are going to be independents and Democrats in swing states who are either sufficiently motivated to turn out to vote or not.
Well, I guess I always finish up by asking what we're keeping an eye on. Of course, the impeachment hearing tomorrow. What else before we catch you next week?
I mean, beyond the impeachment hearing, I wouldn't be surprised if over the course of the next few days, some more of these candidates on the Democratic side start dropping out. Tom Steyer qualified for the December debate. His campaign released a statement today, so he's in it to stay. He and Michael Bloomberg obviously have no concerns about money or the ability to build an infrastructure, but some of these other candidates do. Cory Booker, for example, again has gone out and basically pled for the money and the donations required to qualify for the next debate. He did that and it worked once. It's unclear that that will work again. So, I mean, I don't know if he's the next one to go, but my prediction is that next week at this time, the field will be even slimmer.
Now, hearing reports that Steyer in Iowa, spending so much time, attention, and money there, is having a adverse impact. I guess he's oversaturating the market. Let's talk a little. Can you possibly do that?
You can. And the thing to keep in mind about Iowa and New Hampshire is that these voters are weird, right? So they're accustomed, I mean, and it's not their fault. They're given a very weird set of circumstances every 4 years that they're expected to navigate. And so most of them are accustomed to speaking to candidates multiple times. They're accustomed to meeting these candidates. They're accustomed to these candidates showing up in diners and knocking on their doors. And a national campaign where they're just flooding the airwaves sort of runs counter to the really, retail politics nature of Iowa and New Hampshire. So I think it can backfire in that way. That said, that kind of strategy could potentially work on Super Tuesday if different candidates win Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina.
And of course, we know Democratic contender Michael Bloomberg is all in spending for Super Tuesday. But we will continue to keep an eye on D.C., the impeachment hearing tomorrow, and who stays in the Democratic 2020 primary race moving forward. Jennifer Lawless down at the University of Virginia, thank you for taking the time to Skype in.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to let Professor Lawless go. We're going to get a lot more local here with GoLocal's resident doctor. We'll be right back.